There's an old saying in Texas, the most dangerous predators are the ones you never see coming. In the winter of 2024, the Azteca cartel learned this lesson through blood and fire when they decided to target what seemed like an easy mark. A solitary rancher in Shadow Valley. They saw Marcus Ramirez as just another stubborn old-timer refusing to sell his strategically located ranch. What they didn't know was that Marcus had spent 22 years as one of America's deadliest Marine scout snipers, with over 180 confirmed missions in places the government still keeps classified. When the cartel's intimidation tactics escalated to violence, they discovered too late that they weren't dealing with a helpless rancher. They were facing a tactical genius who would systematically dismantle their entire operation using skills honed through decades of special operations. The morning frost still clung to the grass as Marcus Ramirez's weathered Ford pickup wound its way through Shadow Valley's narrow roads. His calloused hands rested easily on the steering wheel, dark eyes constantly scanning the terrain with the unconscious habit of a man who'd spent decades keeping himself alive in hostile territory. The horse trailer behind him swayed gently, his prized Arabian stallion Phantom shifting restlessly inside. Sheriff Elena Castillo stood in front of the local cafe, watching the newcomer with professional interest. 15 years in law enforcement along the border had taught her to read people, and something about Ramirez's bearing caught her attention. The way the older man carried himself, the methodical way he surveyed the street. This wasn't just another retiree looking for a quiet place to settle. "Morning," Castillo called out as Marcus parked in front of Diego Martinez's real estate office. "Welcome to Shadow Valley." Marcus nodded, his voice quiet but clear. "Looking to buy the old Carson Ranch." "Big spread," Castillo commented. "Lot of work for one man." A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's weathered face. "Been handling bigger jobs my whole life, Sheriff." Inside the real estate office, Diego Martinez was already having second thoughts about showing the Carson Ranch. Just that morning, he'd received another visit from Victor El Coyote Sanchez, the Azteca cartel's local commander, making it clear they had plans for that property. "It's a challenging property," Martinez began carefully, adjusting his tie nervously. "Needs significant work. Maybe I could show you something smaller." Marcus's dark eyes met his. The Carson place. Something in that quiet tone made Martinez reconsider his hesitation. He gathered the paperwork with slightly trembling hands, remembering El Coyote's threats, but finding himself more unsettled by the calm intensity of the elderly man before him. The drive to the ranch was silent. Martinez, stealing glances at his passenger, Marcus sat perfectly still, but his eyes never stopped moving, taking in every detail of the landscape, noting ridgelines, approaches, natural choke points. When they arrived, he walked the property with the same methodical precision, paying special attention to sightlines and defensive positions. "Previous owner passed last fall," Martinez explained, watching Marcus study the terrain. "His children have been trying to sell, but the cartel wants it," Marcus finished. It wasn't a question. At the local cafe, Maria Torres was serving coffee to Dr. Mia Chen when they heard the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs pulled up outside, their tinted windows gleaming in the morning sun. Ramon El Tijeras Lopez, Sanchez's second-in-command, led a group of cartel soldiers inside. "Doc," Lopez nodded to Mia, "heard we got a newcomer in town." Old man looking at the Carson place. "Patient confidentiality," Mia replied coolly, though she hadn't treated Marcus yet. Something about the elderly rancher's arrival had clearly rattled the cartel members. Lopez smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just being neighborly. Wouldn't want him making a mistake buying property that might not be healthy for him. The bell above the cafe door chimed. Marcus walked in, his movements unhurried but purposeful. The conversation died as he made his Away to the counter, the cartel members watching him with poorly concealed interest. "Coffee, black," he told Maria, then turned slightly to face Lopez. "Heard you were asking about me." Lopez straightened, trying to use his height advantage. "Just looking out for potential neighbors. Carson Ranch isn't right for everyone." "Seems right for me." Marcus's voice remained soft, but something in his tone made several patrons shift uncomfortably. "Yeah?" Lopez leaned closer. "Ever owned a ranch before, old man. Had various jobs." Marcus sipped his coffee. "Learned to handle difficult situations." The way he said it made even Lopez pause. There was something in the older man's demeanor that didn't quite fit. A stillness that spoke of experience rather than age, confidence rather than stubbornness. The quiet certainty of a man who had faced far worse than cartel intimidation. Later, that afternoon, Sheriff Castillo watched Marcus sign the property papers in Martinez's office. She'd made some calls, trying to background the newcomer. 22 years of military service, record sealed, just a notation of honorable discharge and a chest full of medals no one would talk about. "Bought it outright," Martinez whispered to Castillo afterward. "Cash deal. Never seen anything like it." As Marcus drove toward his new property, 2 black SUVs fell in behind his truck. They followed at a distance, probably thinking they were being subtle. Marcus allowed himself another ghost of a smile in his rearview mirror. He could see Lopez talking on a phone, likely reporting to Sanchez. The cartel had no way of knowing they'd just started a war they couldn't win. They saw an old man, a potential victim. What they were actually seeing was a highly trained operative, doing what he did best, letting the enemy choose the battlefield, never realizing they were walking into a trap. Marcus parked in front of his new ranch house, Phantom nickering softly in the trailer. The SUVs kept going, dust rising behind them as they headed back to town. Inside the house, Marcus began a methodical inspection, his trained eye noting defensive positions, potential vulnerabilities, and tactical advantages that would make any military strategist proud. The Carson Ranch sat on a strategic piece of land, its position commanding key routes through Shadow Valley. Marcus had chosen it carefully, spending months tracking cartel movements before making his move. The property's natural features provided excellent cover and clear lines of sight, perfect for what was coming. In town, Dr. Mia Chen was updating old medical records when Maria brought her more coffee. "What do you make of him?" the cafe owner asked. Mia considered the question. "His hands," she said finally. "Did you notice them? Those aren't rancher's calluses. They're from something else entirely. The way he holds himself, the way he moves. I've seen that before during my time with Doctors Without Borders in conflict zones." The sun was setting over Shadow Valley, painting the mountains in shades of amber and gold. Marcus stood on his new porch, watching the light fade. Tomorrow, he'd begin preparing the ranch, not just as a home, but as something else, a carefully crafted tactical position. The cartel would come eventually, proving once again that some men mistake silence for weakness, age for vulnerability. They would learn, as others had before them, why Marcus Ramirez had survived all those years in places the government denied existing. The quiet rancher allowed himself one last smile as darkness fell. The Azteca cartel thought they were the predators in this valley. They were wrong. Dawn broke over the Carson Ranch, Marcus's ranch now, painting the Texas sky in shades of fire. He'd spent the night mapping every inch of the property in his mind, old habits from a lifetime of operating in hostile territory taking over. The ranch house sat on a slight rise, offering clear views of the approaching roads. Natural features could provide cover or become deadly kill zones, depending on who was using them. Rosa Carson's arrival was announced by the crunch of gravel under tires. Marcus watched her ancient Chevy truck approach, noting how she deliberately parked where the morning sun wouldn't silhouette her against the house. Old habits, different. Profession, Brought you breakfast, she called out, lifting a basket. Figured you wouldn't have supplies yet. Marcus opened the screen door, gesturing her inside. The house was sparse. He traveled light, always had. But Rosa noticed the furniture had already been subtly rearranged, optimizing sightlines to windows and doors. 25 years my father worked this land, she said, unpacking still warm tortillas. Kept the deed clean despite them cartel boys trying every trick. Would have wanted someone strong-willed to take over. Tell me about the Azteca cartel. Marcus's voice was quiet, measured. Started moving in 3 years back, buying up land, pushing out families who've been here generations. They want the valley. Something about its location being perfect for their operations. At the cartel's compound on the outskirts of Shadow Valley, Victor Sanchez was studying a map marked with their property acquisitions. Marcus's purchase of the Carson Ranch had created a dangerous gap in their plans. What did you find out? He asked Lopez, who'd spent the night making calls. Military records are sealed tight, but I got a buddy in the VA says the old man's file has more black ink than text. Whatever he did, someone wants it kept quiet. Sanchez's expression darkened. Get some men up there, test him. Nothing serious, just see how he handles pressure. In town, Dr. Mia Chen was treating Miguel Rivera's son for a broken arm when she overheard Tijeras Lopez on his phone. Yeah? Heading up to the old Carson place now. Going to have some fun with the new owner. Mia waited until he left, then called Sheriff Castillo. The lawwoman was already pulling on her jacket. Saw 3 vehicles heading that way. Might want to have your bag ready, Doc. Marcus was mending fences when he heard the vehicles. 3 SUVs approaching fast enough to kick up dust. He continued working, his movements unhurried, but his senses shifted into a familiar combat awareness. Distance, cover, weapons, old calculations running automatically. Nice spread you got here, old-timer, the lead cartel soldier called out, cutting his engine. Marcus recognized him as one of Lopez's lieutenants. The cartel men spread out, trying to surround him. Amateur move. They'd positioned themselves so the morning sun would blind them if they had to face west. Marcus drove another fence post into the ground, his movements precise. Long drive just to make threats. The cartel soldiers spread out, trying to surround him. No threats, the leader grinned. Just wanting to make sure you understand how things work here. This is Azteca territory. This is my land, Marcus replied softly. Something in his tone made one of the cartel men shift uneasily. For now, the leader moved closer. But accidents happen, especially to stubborn old men who don't. Marcus's movement was so smooth, it took them a moment to realize what had happened. The fence post driver was suddenly in his hands like a weapon. His stance shifted subtly into something that spoke of decades of close combat training. 3 men. Marcus's voice remained conversational. 3 vehicles, all within reach. Really. Want to discuss accidents? The leader's hand twitched toward his jacket. Marcus's eyes flickered to it. That's a Glock 19 in your shoulder holster. You're favoring your right side, telling me where you'll draw. Your friend on the left has a knife in his boot. He keeps touching it. The one behind me is too busy watching for witnesses to be an immediate threat. The color drained from their faces. This wasn't the rambling analysis of an old man. It was the cold, tactical assessment of a professional killer. Now, Marcus continued, I'm going to finish mending my fence. You're going to leave. When Sanchez asks, tell him I prefer direct conversations to amateur intimidation. Sheriff Castillo arrived just in time to see the cartel vehicles rushing away, their SUVs kicking up dust clouds in their haste. She found Marcus calmly driving another fence post. Everything okay out here? Just fine, Marcus replied. Some folks needed a lesson in manners. Castillo studied him carefully. Those boys usually don't back down easy. Most men, Marcus said, measuring the next post, back down when they realize they're not the most dangerous thing around. Back in town, Mia Chen was surprised by a visit from Rosa Carson. The older woman seemed troubled. "Sold the ranch to a good man," Rosa said quietly. "But I'm worried. The Azteca cartel. They're not used to being refused. Last family that stood up to them had their barn burned with their horses inside." "Marcus seems capable of handling himself," Mia replied, remembering the controlled confidence she'd sensed in him. "That's what worries me," Rosa admitted. "There's something in his eyes. Reminds me of my brother after he came back from Afghanistan. The look of a man who's seen too much and learned too well how to deal with it." At the cartel compound, the three soldiers were reporting to Sanchez and Lopez. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that made their leaders exchange glances. "He knew things," one of them stammered, "about our weapons, our positions, talked about angles and draw times like he was reading a manual." Sanchez's expression hardened. "So the old man's got some training. Doesn't change anything." He paused, considering. "But from now on we do this smart. No more amateur hour." As evening approached, Marcus sat on his porch cleaning a high-powered rifle. To anyone watching, it would appear to be normal ranch maintenance, but his methodical movements were those of a man who'd cleaned weapons in far more hostile environments than this. Sheriff Castillo pulled up just as the sun was setting. "Thought you might want to know, Sanchez has been making calls all afternoon, calling in people from other territories." Marcus nodded, not looking up from his work. "Expected that. Men like him don't handle surprise well." "You sure you want to take this on?" Castillo asked. "No shame in selling moving somewhere quieter." Marcus's hands never stopped their precise movement with the rifle. "Sometimes, Sheriff, the quietest places are where the most important stands need to be made." As darkness fell over Shadow Valley, the first stars appearing above the mountains, both sides of the coming conflict were making preparations. The cartel was gathering their forces, calling in favors and planning their next move. But in the growing darkness, Marcus Ramirez was in his element, preparing his property with the same tactical precision that had kept him alive through countless missions. The war for Shadow Valley was about to begin, and only one side truly understood what that meant. Marcus spent the night setting up surveillance systems and preparing defensive positions. His military training had taught him that preparation was everything. He installed motion sensors disguised as normal ranch equipment, established multiple fallback positions, and created natural choke points that could be turned into kill zones. At a moment's notice, in town, Dr. Chen received an unexpected visit from one of her regular patients, an elderly woman who'd lived in Shadow Valley all her life. "Things are changing," the woman said, looking nervously over her shoulder. "Cartel's been making calls, bad people coming to our valley." Mia nodded, remembering what she'd seen in conflict zones. "The question is, who's going to stand up to them?" At the cartel compound, Sanchez was briefing his reinforcements, hardened sicarios from across the border, men who solved problems permanently. "The old man's made us look weak," he growled. "That ends now. But this isn't just about one stubborn rancher. That ranch controls the only viable access point we don't own. Without it, our entire operation stays vulnerable." Marcus watched the valley through his night vision scope, noting the increased traffic. On normally quiet roads, the cartel was bringing in muscle, thinking numbers would make the difference. They still hadn't realized they were playing his game. Rosa Carson visited again the next morning, bringing more supplies. "They're watching the ranch," she said, helping Marcus move hay bales that just happened to create perfect cover. "Got men on the ridges thinking they're being subtle. Let them watch," Marcus replied, positioning another bale. "Sometimes the best trap is the one they see you setting." Sheriff Castillo was fighting her own battles at the county office. The mayor had called her in, pressure evident in his voice. These cartel people, they bring money to the valley. One stubborn rancher isn't worth the trouble. Funny thing about trouble, Castillo replied, standing her ground. You give in to it once, it owns you forever. Marcus continued his preparations, each move calculated, each position carefully chosen. He'd fought against cartels before, in operations that would never appear in any official record. They all had the same weakness, arrogance. They were so used to people backing down that they didn't know how to handle someone who stood their ground. Dr. Chen, watching cartel vehicles, patrol the streets, remembered her time in war zones. It's starting, she told Sheriff Castillo. The way they're moving, the people they're bringing in. I've seen this before. This is how it begins. By nightfall, Shadow Valley hummed with tension. The cartel had brought in over 30 new men, their vehicles moving through town with impunity, but Marcus Ramirez watched from his ranch, calm and prepared. The war for Shadow Valley was about to enter its next phase, and he was ready. The quiet rancher allowed himself a small smile as he checked his defenses one final time. The cartel thought numbers would make the difference, that enough guns and enough men would force him to back down. They were about to learn why Marcus Ramirez had survived all those years in places the government denied existing, why his military records remained sealed, and why the truly dangerous ones are the ones who wait patiently for their enemies to walk into their trap. Shadow Valley woke to the thunder of engines as heavily modified pickup trucks and SUVs rolled into town, their occupants wearing the distinct markers of cartel soldiers from across the border. This wasn't just a show of force, it was a declaration of intent. Maria Torres watched from her cafe as leather-clad figures filled the street. Counted 30 vehicles so far, she told Sheriff Castillo over the phone. More still coming. At his ranch, Marcus observed the distant dust clouds through his high-powered scope. He'd spent the night making preparations, subtle changes to the landscape that would only make sense to someone with combat experience. Natural choke points enhanced, escape routes established, firing positions carefully planned. Dr. Mia Chen's morning got complicated when cartel members brought in one of their own with a dislocated shoulder. The injury was suspicious, the kind that came from being thrown by someone who knew exactly how to do it. Happened up at Ramirez's place, one of them muttered. Tried to sneak up on his horse. Old man moved like nothing I've ever seen. Mia set the shoulder, her mind racing. The injury was textbook, the kind taught in advanced military combat courses. You're lucky, she said quietly. This could have been much worse. Meanwhile, Sanchez and Lopez were holding court at the cartel. In compound, sicarios from Chihuahua, Sonora, and beyond crowded the room, their presence showing the Azteca cartel's true reach. Ramirez is making us look weak, Sanchez addressed the gathering. That ends now. But this isn't just about one stubborn. Old man, that ranch is key to everything we've been building. The valley's isolation, the access to back roads, it's perfect for our distribution network. Lopez unrolled a map marked with existing territories and planned expansion routes. The Carson Ranch controls the only viable access point we don't own. Without it, the whole operation stays vulnerable. In town, Sheriff Castillo was dealing with increasingly nervous citizens. The sudden influx of cartel soldiers had everyone on edge. She found Rosa Carson at the grocery store, calmly buying supplies. Taking these up to Marcus, she explained. Man needs support when he's standing his ground. You seem awful confident in him, Castillo observed. Rosa's eyes took on a distant look. My brother served in special forces. Said you could always tell the truly dangerous ones. They're the quiet ones, the ones who plan 10 steps ahead. Your new rancher, he's got that same look. Marcus's morning was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Diego Martinez pulled up in his realtor's car, visibly nervous. They sent me with an offer, he said, holding out an envelope. 5 times what you paid. Said it would be smart to take it. Marcus took the envelope without opening it. "Tell Sanchez if he wants to talk. He knows where to find me. You don't understand." Martinez's voice cracked. "This goes beyond Shadow Valley. The Azteca cartel has connections, major distribution networks. They're not just some local operation." "No," Marcus agreed quietly. "There are men who think violence and numbers make them invincible. I've met their kind before." At the local clinic, Mia was reviewing Marcus's initial medical records, or trying to. Most were classified, but what she could access told a story. Multiple surgeries in military hospitals worldwide, injuries consistent with high-risk operations, recovery times that defied normal medical expectations. A commotion outside drew her to the window. Tijeras Lopez was organizing a group of sicarios, their vehicles lined up with military precision. She recognized the formation from her time as a military doctor, search and intimidate tactics. Marcus spent the afternoon making his own preparations. He'd identified natural ambush points, created hidden caches of supplies, and established multiple fallback positions. To anyone watching, it would have looked like normal ranch work. But Rosa Carson, bringing more supplies, recognized the tactical thinking behind each adjustment. "Used to watch my brother do similar things," she noted, helping him move equipment that just happened to create perfect cover. "Called it passive defense, making the ground work for you." "Your brother taught Special Forces hand-to-hand combat," Marcus replied without looking up. "His techniques saved my life more than once." Rosa's eyes widened slightly. "You knew him?" "Trained under him in Euro 2. Best instructor I ever had." At the sheriff's office, Castillo was on the phone with state police. "No, can't prove they're planning anything illegal. Yes, they're all legitimate vehicles, but something's coming. I can feel it." Her deputy rushed in. "Sheriff, we got trouble. Lopez's crew is heading up to Ramirez's place. 20 vehicles, all armed." Castillo grabbed her jacket. "Call Dr. Chen. Tell her to be ready." But when she arrived at the ranch, she found an eerie calm. Marcus sat on his porch, drinking coffee. The cartel vehicles were gone. "What happened?" "They tested the perimeter," Marcus replied calmly. "Lost 3 vehicles in hidden pits. 4 more couldn't handle the improvised oil slicks. The rest decided to reconsider their approach." Castillo stared at him. "You booby-trapped your own ranch?" "Just encouraged them to think carefully about their choices." Marcus sipped his coffee. "No serious injuries this time." As evening approached, Shadow Valley hummed with tension. The cartel had gathered at their compound. Their numbers swelled by out-of-state reinforcements, but the mood wasn't triumphant. Word had spread about the afternoon's failed intimidation attempt. Sanchez paced in his office, furious. "I want to know everything about him. Military records, combat history, every operation he was ever involved in." "Already tried," Lopez replied. "It's all classified. But I found something interesting. Rumors about a Marine sniper in the 2000s. They called him El Fantasma because he could turn entire compounds into death traps overnight. Never confirmed if he was real or just a legend used to scare cartels." In the gathering darkness, Marcus made his final checks of the property. Motion sensors disguised as normal ranch equipment. Pressure plates hidden under innocent-looking ground cover, escape routes that could become kill zones with the flip of a switch. Tomorrow would bring escalation. The cartel wouldn't take today's humiliation lightly. But as Marcus watched the sunset over his new home, he allowed himself a small smile. They still hadn't realized the truth. They weren't the hunters here. They were walking into a trap 22 years in the making. The cartel made their move just after midnight. 20 vehicles approached Marcus's ranch from different directions, their headlights off, engines barely above idle. Behind them came 4 armored SUVs carrying their most experienced sicarios. They thought they were being clever. Marcus watched them through his night vision scope, noting their positions with the detached precision of a man who'd done this countless times before. Approaching from 4 directions, he murmured into a digital recorder, maintaining his habit of documenting operations. Amateur spacing, predictable routes. They're following the obvious paths, exactly as expected. In town, Sheriff Castillo sat in her patrol car, parked in darkness. She'd positioned herself strategically, not close enough to interfere, but near enough to respond if things went too far. Her radio crackled with updates from Deputy Garcia, watching from another vantage point. Multiple vehicles heading toward Ramirez's property, Garcia whispered. Should we intervene? Not yet, Castillo replied, remembering her conversation with Marcus earlier that day. They'll come at night, Marcus had told her. Let them. Sometimes the best way to end a fight is to let your opponent make their biggest mistake all at once. The first sign that something was wrong came when the lead vehicles hit Marcus's defensive preparations. Hidden cables at neck height took down 3 drivers. Their vehicles crashed silently, throttles modified to minimize noise. Before the others could react, the ground seemed to come alive beneath them. Carefully concealed pits, their edges reinforced with military-grade materials, swallowed 2 more trucks. What the hell? Lopez's voice carried in the darkness. He'd been coordinating from one of the armored SUVs, watching his careful plan dissolve into chaos. The remaining vehicles found themselves caught in pre-sighted killing zones, though Marcus's fire was deliberately non-lethal. Mid-bag rounds and rubber bullets fired with sniper precision took down driver after driver, each shot finding gaps in their protective gear, hitting pressure points and nerve clusters with surgical accuracy. Spread out, Sanchez ordered over their radio channel. He's just one man, he can't cover all angles. A quiet voice responded on their frequency. Actually, I can. The cartel communications erupted in confusion. Marcus had hacked their channel, a skill learned from years of signals intelligence work. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. 6 men down at the north approach, he narrated, calmly. 4 more about to discover the quicksand pits to the east. The rest of you might want to reconsider your choices. Dr. Mia Chen, waiting at her clinic, heard the first calls for medical assistance. As she prepared for incoming injuries, she studied the pattern emerging, each wound precisely placed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. This wasn't random defense, it was a demonstration. The armored SUVs tried to push through, their drivers hoping weight and momentum would overcome any obstacles. They discovered their mistake when electromagnetic pulses generated by carefully hidden military-grade devices killed their engines simultaneously. You're all in fixed positions now. Marcus's voice came through their dead radios, transmitted through a separate system. Surrounded by terrain I've prepared for the past week. Ask yourselves, do you really want to see what else I've got planned? In one of the SUVs, Lopez watched his teams collapse with growing horror. He's not defending, he realized suddenly. This whole thing was a trap. He wanted us to try this. Back in town, Rosa Carson sat with Maria Torres at the cafe, both women, listening to the chaos unfolding over the police scanner they weren't supposed to have. My brother used to talk about men like him, Rosa said quietly. Said the truly dangerous ones don't just react, they make you do exactly what they want, exactly when they want it. The cartel's operation had completely unraveled, nearly half. Their force was down, taken out by non-lethal but extremely effective measures. The rest found themselves pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to pre-sighted positions. Listen carefully, Marcus's voice came through their radios again. Your injured need medical attention. They'll receive it once you withdraw. I've demonstrated what I can do with non-lethal methods. Don't make me show you the alternatives. Sanchez, watching his carefully planned assault turn into a complete disaster, finally gave the order to retreat. As his men limped back to town, he turned to Lopez with a face carved from stone. Call them, he ordered. Call all of them. I want every heavy hitter we have. That old man just bought himself a war. At the clinic, Dr. Chen treated a steady stream of injuries. Bruises, sprains, impact trauma, all expertly placed to incapacitate without crippling. One of the younger cartel soldiers, still dazed, kept muttering about shadows coming alive and the ground itself turning against them. Sheriff Castillo finally drove up to Marcus's ranch as dawn approached. She found the veteran calmly erasing signs of the night's activities, restoring his defenses for the next encounter. That was quite a statement, Castillo observed. Had to show them what they're dealing with. Marcus checked another trap, resetting it with practiced ease. Sometimes, the best way to prevent escalation is to demonstrate the consequences. They'll come back harder, Castillo warned. Yes, Marcus agreed, but now they'll be scared. Fear makes men predictable. Predictable men make mistakes. As the sun rose over Shadow Valley, word of the night's events spread rapidly. The cartel's reputation for invincibility had been shattered by one man who turned their own aggression against them. But in his office, Sanchez was already making calls to darker corners of their organization. I don't care what it costs, he growled into his phone. I want our best people, the ones we call when we need problems permanently solved. Marcus spent the morning maintaining his defenses, his movements methodical and unhurried. To anyone watching, he might have appeared calm, even unconcerned, but Mia Chen, bringing him supplies under the pretense of checking for injuries, noticed how his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings. You knew exactly where to hit them, she said, exactly how to disable without killing. Sometimes the most effective violence is the violence you don't have to use, Marcus replied, accepting the supplies. But they're about to change the rules, might not have that luxury next time. Shadow Valley held its breath, waiting for the cartel's response. The quiet town was about to become a battlefield, and only one man seemed truly prepared for what that meant. Shadow Valley had never seen men like the ones who arrived 3 days after Marcus's night of defense. They came in unmarked vehicles, not the flashy trucks favored by regular cartel soldiers. 5 men with cold eyes and precise movements, carrying themselves with the practiced efficiency that only comes from years of professional violence. Former military contractors, Marcus noted, watching through his scope as they assembled at the cartel compound. Private sector now, expensive talent. In town, Dr. Mia Chen was treating one of the younger cartel soldiers for a sprained wrist when she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. The mercenaries weren't just here for Marcus, they were preparing to clear the entire valley for something bigger. Got the call from overseas, one mercenary said quietly. Shipments start next month. Valley needs to be secured by then. At the sheriff's office, Castillo was fighting her own battle. The county commissioner had called, pushing her to find some reason to arrest Marcus. These cartel people bring business to the county, the commissioner argued. One stubborn rancher isn't worth the trouble. With all due respect, sir, Castillo replied, I don't think you understand what kind of man we're dealing with. Marcus's morning was interrupted by Rosa Carson's truck racing up his driveway, her face ashen, hands shaking as she gripped her steering wheel. They came to my house, she said without preamble. Those new men said they know about my granddaughter. In Houston, said accidents happen to college students all the time. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Stay here, he said quietly. Your room's already prepared. He'd known this was coming, had prepared guest rooms with defensive positions and escape routes. Rosa would be safer here than anywhere else in the valley. In town, one of the mercenaries was demonstrating why Sanchez had paid so much for their services. He walked into Maria's cafe during the lunch rush, moving with lethal grace. Just coffee, he told Maria, then raised his voice slightly. And information about Marcus Ramirez. 20,000 for anything useful. The cafe fell silent. Then old Miguel Rivera, who'd lived in Shadow Valley for 70 years, stood up. Got some information for you, he said clearly. That ranch you're so interested in, ground's been soaked in blood before. My grandfather used to say some land chooses its owners. Might want to think about that. The mercenary moved with stunning speed, but he never reached Miguel. Marcus, who'd entered silently, moments before, stepped between them. His movement was so smooth, so perfectly economical, that most patrons didn't even realize what happened. One moment, the mercenary was advancing, the next, he was frozen in place, Marcus's hand positioned to end things permanently. Poor choice, Marcus said softly. The mercenary felt cold steel pressed precisely against his kidney. He hadn't even seen Marcus draw the combat knife. You're dead, the mercenary growled. Just don't know it yet. We're not like the regular crew. We're professionals. No! Marcus's voice remained conversational. You're men playing at war. I am war. He released the mercenary with a slight push. The man stumbled, his trained grace suddenly absent. For the first time he felt what the younger cartel soldiers had been trying to describe, the sensation of being in the presence of something far deadlier than himself. Dr. Chen, witnessing the scene, finally understood what she'd seen in Marcus's classified records. The way he moved, the precision of his control. This wasn't just military training. This was something else entirely. At the compound, the mercenaries, regrouped with Sanchez and Lopez. Your old man's got serious training, their leader admitted. Might be Tier 1 background, maybe Force Recon. Sanchez slammed his fist on the table. I don't care if he's goddamn John Rambo. I want him gone. Careful what you wish for, the mercenary replied quietly. Men like him, there's a reason their records are sealed, a reason people speak of them in whispers. Marcus spent the afternoon making preparations of a different kind. He visited key points in town, speaking quietly with selected residents. Each conversation was brief, but when he left, those people began making their own preparations. Sheriff Castillo, watching this, finally understood. You're not just defending your ranch, she said when Marcus stopped by her office. You're preparing the whole town. They showed their hand with Rosa, Marcus replied. This isn't about one property anymore. They want the valley. That means everyone's involved, whether they want to be or not. As evening approached, Mia Chen drove up to Marcus's ranch with medical supplies. She found him teaching Rosa Carson how to use the defensive features he'd built into the house. I accessed some restricted medical files, Mia told him quietly. Operation Ghost Spear, that was you, wasn't it? The operative who specialized in turning territory against aggressors. Marcus's silence was answer enough. Those mercenaries they brought in, she continued. They're planning something big. I heard them talking about major shipments, huge distribution networks. I know, Marcus replied. Been tracking their routes since before I bought the ranch. That's why I chose this place. This valley is their weakness, their only viable route. Night fell over Shadow Valley, but few people slept. The cartel's mercenaries had spent the day studying the town, marking positions, making plans, but they didn't realize they were being watched too. Marcus's preparations hadn't just been physical. He'd turned the entire community into a network of observers. In the darkness, Marcus checked his defenses one final time. Tomorrow would bring violence, real violence, not just demonstrations. The cartel had brought in professionals, but they still didn't understand what they were facing. They thought they were hunting a retired Marine. Instead, they were about to learn why some men's military records remain sealed, why some operations are never acknowledged, and why the truly dangerous ones are the ones who wait patiently for their enemies to walk into their trap. The mercenaries made their move at dawn, using techniques that had worked in a dozen other conflicts. They approached Marcus's ranch in tactical formation that spoke of years of professional experience. Their leader, a man known only as Drake, had orchestrated similar operations worldwide, But as they crossed the outer perimeter of Marcus's property, Drake felt something he hadn't experienced in years: doubt. The ranch was too quiet. No dogs barking, no early morning activity, just silence in the growing light of dawn. "Something's wrong," Drake muttered into his radio. "He's waiting for us." From his hidden position, Marcus watched through his scope. Their formation was perfect, their approach professional, but they'd made one critical mistake. They were fighting on ground he'd prepared for the past month. The first sign that this wasn't a normal operation came when Drake's communications went dead. Not jammed, just dead. In the growing light, he saw why. Dozens of small devices scattered across the property, military-grade signal killers that shouldn't have been available to civilians. "He's got better equipment than we do," Drake's second-in-command whispered. Marcus's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, transmitted through speakers hidden across the property. "Last chance to walk away. Next demonstration won't be non-lethal." Drake had heard similar warnings in combat zones. The tone was unmistakable. This wasn't bravado. This was a professional stating facts. In town, Dr. Mia Chen was preparing her clinic when Sheriff Castillo rushed in. "Got a call from a contact in the FBI," she said breathlessly. "Finally got a hit on some of Marcus's records. He wasn't just Marine Force recon. He was part of something called Project Phantom." "The what?" "Classified units specialized in dismantling criminal organizations by turning their own territory against them. Everything else is redacted." At the ranch, the mercenaries discovered why Marcus's reputation had spread through combat. Zones like whispered legend. Their carefully planned approach fell apart as the very ground seemed to fight against them. Hidden pits appeared where solid earth should be, tear gas canisters triggered by their own movement, and every attempt to gain tactical advantage led them into pre-sighted killing zones. Drake watched his team's formation crumble. "Fall back," he ordered. "Full retreat." Too late, Marcus's voice came again. "You crossed the line when you threatened Rosa Carson." The first mercenary went down so fast, the others barely saw it happen. A shadow moved through the morning mist, and suddenly their close-quarters combat specialist was unconscious, taken out with a precision that spoke of decades of experience. "Jesus Christ," one of them breathed. "He's not just good, he's..." The second mercenary never finished his sentence. Marcus moved like smoke, his techniques a deadly mix of military training and hard-earned combat experience. Each strike was precisely calculated, targeting nerve clusters and weak points with surgical accuracy. At the Cartel compound, Sanchez and Lopez watched through binoculars as their expensive professionals were systematically dismantled. "What the hell did you get us into?" Lopez demanded. "That's not some retired Marine. That's something else entirely." From behind them came Rosa Carson's voice, cold and clear. "You should have done better research. Project Phantom wasn't about killing. It was about breaking organizations from the inside out." They spun to find her standing there, shotgun held with familiar confidence. More townspeople emerged from the shadows, armed and ready. The cartel had been so focused on Marcus, they'd missed his real strategy. He'd been preparing the whole town. Back at the ranch, Drake found himself the last mercenary standing. His team lay scattered across the property, each taken down with precision that bordered on artistry. Through the clearing mist, he saw Marcus approaching, moving with the calm certainty of a man who'd never doubted the outcome. "Project Phantom," Drake said quietly, "should have recognized the signs, the way you prepared the ground, the psychological warfare. You're the one they talked about in Kandahar, the shadow that broke the entire Eastern smuggling network. You threatened an innocent family," Marcus replied softly. "Made it personal." "We've got resources," Drake tried. "International connections. This isn't over." "Yes," Marcus's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "It is." The fight that followed was brief but instructive. Drake was good. Very good. But Marcus moved like something from another world, each technique honed by decades of operations in places the government denied existing. When it ended, Drake lay unconscious, defeated by a man who'd forgotten more about combat than most would ever learn. Dr. Chen arrived to treat the injured mercenaries, noting how each had been disabled with precision that spoke of intimate knowledge, of human anatomy. "You could have killed them," she said quietly. "Death teaches no lessons," Marcus replied, helping her with her medical bag. "But they'll remember this. Sometimes memory is a better deterrent than a grave." In town, the cartel found themselves facing an awakened community. Armed citizens watched their every move, cameras recorded their activities, and their usual intimidation tactics fell flat against people who'd found their courage. Sanchez sat in his office, reviewing what they knew about Marcus's background. The Project Phantom files were heavily redacted, but one phrase kept appearing: specializes in converting hostile territory into unsurvivable ground for targeted organizations. "We didn't just pick a fight with a retired Marine," Lopez realized. "We picked a fight with the man they sent to destroy cartels." As evening approached, Marcus helped Dr. Chen load the injured mercenaries into ambulances. Drake, barely conscious, grabbed his arm. "The shipments," he mumbled. "You don't understand what's coming. The people we work for, they don't accept failure." "I know exactly what's coming," Marcus replied. "Been tracking your organization since before I bought the ranch. You're not here for ordinary smuggling. This is about weapons, isn't it? Heavy artillery going north." Drake's eyes widened slightly, confirming Marcus's suspicion. The quiet rancher helped load the last mercenary, then turned to Sheriff Castillo. "Things are about to get complicated," he said softly. "Their real operators will come now. The ones they don't talk about. The ones who solve problems permanently." The sun set over Shadow Valley, painting the sky in shades of blood red. The town had changed. People walked taller, looked their neighbors in the eye. But everyone could feel it. This was just the beginning. The real storm was still coming. Shadow Valley woke to the sound of helicopters. 3 black civilian models touched down at the small municipal airport, disgorging men in expensive suits who moved with military precision. These weren't cartel, soldiers or mercenaries. These were the real powers behind the Azteca cartel's operation. Marcus watched through his scope as a convoy of luxury SUVs left the airport. "Right on schedule," he murmured, noting how they moved in defensive formation, finally showing their true faces. In her clinic, Dr. Mia Chen was examining blood work from the injured mercenaries when she noticed something strange. Trace elements in their systems matched classified reports she'd seen during military service, compounds used by international arms dealers to track their operators. "They're not just running guns," she told Sheriff Castillo. "These are the same markers I saw in Syria. They're moving serious military hardware." Castillo was fighting her own battle. The county commissioner had called an emergency meeting, pushing to have her replaced. "Face it, Elena," the commissioner said. "You're backing the wrong side. These businessmen bring opportunities to the county." "Businessmen?" Castillo laughed coldly. "Is that what we're calling arms dealers now?" At his ranch, Marcus was hosting an unusual gathering. Rosa Carson watched from the kitchen as a group of hard-faced men arrived in unmarked vehicles. They moved like Marcus did, quiet professionals who'd seen too much and learned too well. "Called in some old friends," Marcus explained. "People who understand what we're dealing with." One of them, a weathered man named Jackson, studied Marcus's defense preparations with professional appreciation. "Just like Mogadishu," he commented. "Remember how you turned that whole district into a trap?" "This is different," Marcus replied softly. "This time, we're protecting homes, not just completing missions." In town, the new arrivals made their presence known Alexander Rivera, the cartel's real commander, took over the largest suite at the local hotel. His men began a sophisticated surveillance operation using technology that shouldn't have been available to civilians. Ramirez isn't just some retired operator, Rivera told his team. Intelligence suggests he was part of Project Phantom. They called him El Arquitecto, specialized in turning entire regions into killing grounds. At the cafe, Maria Torres served coffee to men who tried to hide their military bearing behind expensive suits. She noticed how they positioned themselves with clear lines of sight to all entrances, how their eyes constantly scanned for threats. "They're afraid," she told Dr. Chen later. "Not of Marcus's fighting skills. They're afraid of something else." They should be. Marcus's voice made both women jump. He'd entered silently, a habit from years of operations. Just intercepted their communications, the weapons they're trying to move through the valley. They're not just guns, they're next generation prototype weapons, stuff that shouldn't exist. The truth about Shadow Valley's strategic value finally became clear. Its isolated location, its limited law enforcement presence, its network of back roads. Perfect for moving sensitive cargo without oversight. At the cartel compound, Sanchez and Lopez found themselves sidelined by Rivera's operators. "You had one job," Rivera berated them. "Secure the valley quietly. Instead, you've attracted attention to a critical transit point and managed to antagonize one of the few men alive who knows how to dismantle an entire operation single-handedly." Marcus's old colleagues spread through town, each taking responsibility for different sectors. They moved with the invisible efficiency of men who'd spent lifetimes in shadows, strengthening defenses and preparing contingencies. "Your townspeople learn fast," Jackson told Marcus, watching civilians adapt to their defensive protocols. "They've got the same look resistance fighters get. People who've decided enough is enough." Dr. Chen, treating a local teenager for a sprained ankle, noticed the change too. People walked differently, moved with more awareness. Marcus hadn't just taught them to defend themselves, he'd taught them to think like defenders. Rivera's operators attempted their first probe of Marcus's defenses that afternoon. They used cutting-edge surveillance equipment, professional infiltration techniques. They found nothing. Marcus had anticipated their technology, used their own sophistication against them. "He's not just countering our moves," one operator reported. "He's anticipating them. Everything we try was trapped or monitored before we even thought of it." In his hotel room, Rivera received word from his overseas contacts. The weapon shipment couldn't be rerouted. Too many pieces were already in motion. Shadow Valley had to be secured, whatever the cost. "Forget subtlety," he ordered. "Bring in everything. If we have to level the whole valley to secure our route, so be it." But Marcus had anticipated this too. As evening fell, Sheriff Castillo received calls from state police, FBI, and three-letter agencies she'd never heard of. All had suddenly developed intense interest in Shadow Valley. "You're doing?" she asked Marcus. "Amazing what happens when you leak information about illegal weapons shipments to the right people," Marcus replied. "Rivera's masters won't be happy. About the attention. The sun set on a town transformed. Civilians moved with new purpose, their eyes watchful, their movements coordinated. Marcus's veterans had positioned themselves at key points, ready for whatever came next. The cartel's professional operators found themselves in an unfamiliar position, facing an enemy who'd prepared not just tactically, but strategically. "They still don't understand," Marcus told Rosa as they watched the lights come on in town. "They think this is about fighting. It's not. It's about making them face something they've never encountered, a whole community that refuses to be intimidated." Shadow Valley settled into an uneasy night, but it was different now. The fear that had gripped it for so long had been replaced by something else: determination. The cartel had brought in their best operators, their most sophisticated equipment, but they were about to learn why Marcus Ramirez had been the ghost that even other ghosts feared. Rivera's operators struck at midnight, using tactics that had worked in war zones worldwide. They knocked out power to Shadow Valley, deployed signal jammers, and moved in with night vision equipment that cost more than most homes in the valley. Their plan was sophisticated, professional, and completely useless. They cut the power, Jackson reported from his observation post, right on schedule. Time to show them why they called me El Arquitecto, Marcus replied through their secure channel. The town plunged into darkness, but not the darkness Rivera's men expected. Hidden backup systems, carefully prepared by Marcus and the townspeople, created zones of absolute black where night vision became worse than useless. Other areas lit up suddenly, destroying the operators' adapted vision. They're herding us, Rivera realized too late. The whole town's a funnel. Dr. Mia Chen was working late at her clinic when two of Rivera's men entered. They moved with professional smoothness, but something in their manner set off her military-trained instincts. Those compounds we found in the mercenaries' blood work, one said quietly. You need to forget about that. Interesting timing, she replied, pressing a hidden alarm Marcus had installed. I just sent those results to several interested parties. At the sheriff's office, Castillo received a call from the state police commissioner himself. Whatever is happening in Shadow Valley has attracted serious attention, the commissioner said. Federal task force is mobilizing. Keep your people safe until they arrive. Rivera's operators found themselves facing a defensive system unlike anything in their experience. Every route they took had been anticipated. Every tactic countered before they thought of it. The town itself seemed to fight against them. He's not just defending, one operator reported, his professional calm cracking. He's choreographing our entire assault, leading us exactly where he wants us. Marcus watched from his command position as Rivera's men followed the paths he'd prepared weeks ago. His veterans had positioned themselves perfectly, using the townspeople's intelligence network to track every movement. Remember what you taught us in Fallujah? Jackson asked over their channel. About the difference between tactical and strategic thinking? Best trap is the one they walk into willingly, Marcus replied, even when they know it's a trap. The cartel organization began showing cracks. Sanchez and Lopez watched their empire crumbling as Rivera's sophisticated operation fell apart. Local members, seeing the professionals stumble, started questioning their loyalties. This isn't what we signed up for, one senior cartel soldier told Lopez. Moving guns is one thing. These weapons they're planning, it's different. Dr. Chen faced down Rivera's men with military bearing. Those blood samples are already being analyzed by people who understand exactly what they mean. People very interested in tracking illegal weapons. You have no idea what you're interfering with, one operator growled. Actually, Marcus's voice came from the doorway. We know exactly what's coming. Prototype weapons designed to bypass international restrictions, heading for buyers who shouldn't have them. The fight in the clinic was brief but instructive. Rivera's men were good, among the best money could buy, but Marcus moved like something. From their worst training scenarios, each action precise, efficient, and devastatingly effective. You're him, one gasped as Marcus secured them. The one they warned us about, the ghost who dismantled the entire Southeast Asian network. In town, Rivera watched his operation unravel through surveillance feeds. His men, the best operators blood money could buy, were being systematically herded into prepared kill zones and neutralized with almost contemptuous ease. It's not just him, Rivera realized, watching civilian volunteers coordinate with military precision. He's turned the whole town into an operating force. Every citizen is a sensor, every business a potential ambush point. At the ranch, Rosa Carson helped Marcus's veterans coordinate the civilian network they'd established. Street vendors reported operator movements. Delivery drivers mapped patrol patterns. Every attempt at surveillance was met with counter-surveillance. Just like you taught resistance fighters in Eastern Europe, Jackson noted. Turned the whole population into a defense network. Sheriff Castillo, monitoring the situation, finally understood the full scope of Marcus's strategy. "You're not just defending against them," she said. "You're exposing them. Every move they make provides more evidence of their operation." "Best way to stop a weapons shipment," Marcus replied, checking surveillance feeds, "is to make it too hot to move. Rivera's masters won't risk their prototype weapons once they realize how much attention they're attracting." The night's operation ended with Rivera's professional teams scattered, their sophisticated equipment either captured or rendered useless. But more importantly, their presence had been documented by dozens of civilians, their activities logged and reported through channels Marcus had carefully prepared. "You didn't just beat them," Dr. Chen said, treating a minor cut on Marcus's arm. "You made them expose themselves." "Rivera's got one play left," Marcus replied, watching the town's lights come back on. "He'll have to bring in everything now, all their resources, all their remaining operators." Exactly what we've been waiting for. As dawn approached, Shadow Valley hummed with quiet activity. Civilians moved with purpose, checking defensive positions, maintaining their observation networks. Rivera's operators, those still conscious, were escorted to holding cells by state police who'd arrived with suspicious speed. The cartel's sophisticated operation had been dismantled not by superior force, but by superior strategy. Marcus Ramirez hadn't just prepared for their assault. He'd choreographed it, turning their own professionalism against them. Rivera, watching from his hotel room, made the call he'd been dreading. "Send everyone," he ordered. "Whatever it takes, this ends now." But in the growing light, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Everything was proceeding exactly as he'd planned. The real trap wasn't the town's defenses or the civilian network. The real trap was making them commit everything they had to an operation that was already lost. 3 black military helicopters crossed the mountains into Shadow Valley airspace, flying without lights in clear violation of FAA regulations. Inside, Rivera's elite strike team, former special operations soldiers who traded their honor for blood money, checked their weapons one final time. "Remember," Rivera's voice crackled through their comms, "Ramirez isn't just a retired Marine. Project Phantom gave him access to techniques and tactics that don't officially exist. Don't underestimate him." Marcus stood on his porch, listening to the helicopter's approach. Jackson and his other veterans had positioned themselves throughout the town, coordinating with civilian volunteers who'd learned more about asymmetrical warfare in the past weeks than most soldiers learn in years. "Just like Baghdad," Jackson commented through their secure channel. "They think overwhelming force is the answer." "Force is never the answer," Marcus replied softly. "Control is." In town, Dr. Mia Chen was analyzing data from multiple sources. Blood work from the captured operators, intercepted communications, supply manifests. The picture it painted was disturbing. "These weapons, they're moving," she told Sheriff Castillo. "They're not just prototypes, they're testing platforms for something bigger, something that violates every international arms treaty in existence." The sheriff had her own problems. The county commissioner had arrived personally, flanked by private security. "This ends now," he demanded. "Call off your deputies. Let these businessmen resolve their property dispute." Castillo drew herself up to her full height. "Funny thing about property disputes, they don't usually involve illegal weapons shipments and international arms dealers." The strike team's arrival changed everything. They hit multiple targets simultaneously, using tactics that would have overwhelmed most military units. But Marcus had prepared for this too. "Primrose Protocol," he transmitted to his network. "Throughout Shadow Valley, civilians activated defensive measures that transformed familiar streets into deadly ground. Shop windows concealed hardened positions. Delivery trucks blocked crucial intersections. Every advantage the strike team expected turned against them. They're boxing us in, the team leader realized. Every route we take leads to a kill zone. Rivera, watching from his command post, finally understood what they were facing. He's not just defending, he told his superiors over a secured line. He's been preparing this battlefield since before we knew we needed it. Every civilian is a sensor, every business a strong point. The first real casualties came when 3 strike team members tried to secure the clinic. They found Dr. Chen waiting with Marcus's veterans, her military training evident in how she'd prepared her ground. "You know what these weapons could do?" she asked as they led the captured operators away. "What they're designed for. This isn't about profit anymore. This is about preventing a humanitarian disaster." Marcus moved through town like a ghost, appearing where needed most, his actions precise and devastating. The strike team's sophisticated equipment proved useless against someone who'd helped write their tactical playbook. "He's not even fighting us directly," one operator reported, his professional demeanor cracking. "He's using our own protocols against us. Every countermeasure we try was anticipated." Rosa Carson, coordinating civilian observers from the cafe, watched the town she'd known all her life transform into something else. Not a battlefield, but a demonstration of why some men are remembered in whispered legends. "Your brother taught me something vital," Marcus told her during a brief pause. "The best victory isn't the one you win with violence. It's the one you win by making violence impossible." The strike team's assault faltered as their carefully planned operation disintegrated. Each attempt to gain advantage led them deeper into Marcus's prepared ground. Their sophisticated night vision equipment was rendered useless by unexpected light patterns, their communications compromised, their movement predicted and countered. "Fall back," the team leader ordered. "Full retreat and regroup." But retreat wasn't possible. Marcus hadn't just prepared for their attack, he'd ensured they would commit fully to it. Every escape route had been compromised before they arrived. Their own professionalism had become a trap. In his command post, Rivera received the call he'd been dreading. His superiors wanted to know how a simple property acquisition had turned into an exposure of their entire weapons program. "You don't understand," Rivera tried to explain. "Ramirez isn't fighting us. He's dismantling us. Every move we make provides more evidence for federal authorities. He's not trying to beat our operators. He's destroying our entire organization." As night fell over Shadow Valley, the strike team found themselves isolated and outmaneuvered. Marcus's veterans, coordinating with civilian volunteers, had turned the town into a maze of prepared positions and predetermined kill zones. Fallujah was different, Jackson told Marcus, as they watched Rivera's elite operators struggle. "We were working for the government then. This time we're working for something more important," Marcus replied, checking his surveillance feeds. "Always. Well, just took me 30 years to figure that out." The helicopters that had arrived with such menace now sat silent at the municipal airport, their classified electronics compromised and documented by Marcus's people. Each piece of evidence, each captured operator, each intercepted communication formed part of a larger plan. Rivera, watching his operation collapse, finally understood the true nature of his defeat. They hadn't just failed to secure their transport route, they'd exposed their entire network. Federal task forces were already moving, using evidence Marcus had been carefully collecting and distributing since before the first confrontation. "Check your phone." Marcus's voice came through Rivera's personal channel. "Your overseas masters are already going dark, burning connections, trying to distance themselves from what's about to happen here." The night settled over Shadow Valley like a prophecy fulfilled. The strike team, those still capable of movement, found themselves facing not just a prepared defense, but the consequences of their own choices. Marcus Ramirez hadn't just beaten them, He'd turned their own expertise, their own professionalism, into the instrument of their destruction. And in the growing darkness, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The real operation wasn't about defending a town or stopping a weapons shipment. It was about making them commit everything they had to an operation that was designed to fail from the very beginning. Rivera unleashed everything he had left as the first light of dawn touched Shadow Valley. Armored SUVs crashed through barricades while his remaining operators advanced in combat formation. They'd abandoned any pretense of legality now. This was a military-style assault on American soil. Full breach, all points, Rivera ordered through his command net. I don't care about collateral damage anymore. And this, Marcus watched from his command position, his expression unchanged. Right on schedule. He told Jackson, they're following the exact route we prepared. Throughout the town, civilians moved with practiced precision to predetermined positions. What Rivera saw as random barricades and defensive points was actually an interlocking system designed to channel his forces exactly where Marcus wanted. Them. Dr. Mia Chen was transmitting data to federal authorities when Rivera's men hit the clinic. They found her waiting with 3 of Marcus's veterans. The building transformed into a hardened position. You're too late, she told the captured operators minutes later. Everything we've uncovered about your weapons program is already in federal hands. Your overseas buyers are being identified. Sheriff Castillo coordinated with state police units, gathering outside town. We've got FBI tactical teams 20 minutes out, she reported to Marcus. Just need to hold them that long. They won't be needed, Marcus replied calmly. Rivera's about to discover why they called me El Arquitecto. The cartel organization was already fracturing. Local chapter members, seeing the intensity of the conflict, began distancing themselves. Sanchez and Lopez found their own people turning against them as the true nature of their operation became clear. This isn't about running guns anymore, one veteran cartel soldier told Lopez. These weapons you're trying to move, they're designed for mass casualties. We're cartel soldiers, not war criminals. Rivera's assault hit prepared positions throughout Shadow Valley, but found no easy victories. Every street had been modified, every approach covered. Civilian volunteers coordinated with Marcus's veterans using techniques that turned familiar buildings into interlocking defensive positions. It's like attacking a fortress, one operator reported, his professional calm cracking. But the fortress is everywhere. Marcus moved through his prepared positions, coordinating defense with the same quiet efficiency that had made him a legend in combat zones worldwide. Each counterattack was precisely timed, each defensive measure synchronized to maximum effect. Just like you taught us in Mosul, Jackson observed, watching Rivera's forces fragment, make them fight the ground itself. Rosa Carson, coordinating civilian observers, noticed something through her binoculars. Their support teams are pulling back, she reported. The ones handling their sophisticated equipment, they're abandoning positions. Marcus nodded. They finally realized what this was really about. Rivera's superiors are trying to minimize exposure now, cutting losses. At his command post, Rivera received the calls he'd been dreading. His overseas contacts were going dark, their networks compromised by evidence Marcus had been carefully collecting and distributing. You don't understand, Rivera shouted into a satellite phone. Ramirez didn't just stop our operation, he used it to expose our entire network. Every move we made provided more evidence. Dr. Chen, treating wounded from both sides, made a discovery that changed everything. These aren't just arms dealers, she told Marcus. Based on their equipment, their medical supplies, they're working for someone much bigger, someone with government connections. I know, Marcus replied softly. That's why we had to let them commit fully, had to expose not just the weapons, but who was really behind them. The battle for Shadow Valley reached its crescendo as Rivera ordered his remaining forces to converge. On Marcus's ranch, they found exactly what he'd prepared for them, a killing ground where every advantage they possessed became a liability. "Remember what I taught you about strategic thinking?" Marcus asked through their compromised command net. "The best trap isn't the one they see too late. It's the one they walk into, even when they know it's there." Rivera watched his operation collapse with the terrible clarity of a man who finally understands he's been outmaneuvered at every step. His forces hadn't just been defeated, they'd been choreographed, each action contributing to their own exposure. "You played us," he transmitted to Marcus. "This whole thing, from the moment you bought that ranch, you knew what we were planning." "Figured it out 6 months ago," Marcus replied calmly. "Traced your weapons pipeline back to sources that shouldn't exist. Needed you to commit everything you had so we could expose not just your operation but your masters." As federal tactical teams finally reached the town's outskirts, they found most of their work already done. Rivera's forces had been systematically dismantled, their sophisticated equipment captured, their operations documented by hundreds of civilian witnesses. This wasn't about defending a town, Marcus told Sheriff Castillo as they watched federal agents begin their work. It was about making them expose themselves. Every piece of equipment they brought in, every operator they committed, all of it evidence leading back to people who thought they were untouchable. The sun climbed higher, over Shadow Valley, illuminating a battlefield where the deciding factor hadn't been violence but strategy. Marcus Ramirez hadn't just stopped a weapons shipment or defended a town. He'd orchestrated the complete exposure of an international weapons ring that had thought itself beyond the reach of justice. And in his command post, Rivera finally understood the true meaning of Project Phantom. They hadn't trained Marcus Ramirez to be a superior fighter. They'd trained him to be something far more dangerous, a man who could turn an entire community into a weapon against those who would harm it. The truth about Shadow Valley erupted like a storm breaking. 3 black sedans rolled into town, carrying men whose credentials made even federal agents step aside. They weren't military, weren't standard government. They represented something else entirely. Defense contractors, Marcus explained to Sheriff Castillo, watching through his scope. The real players behind Rivera's operation. They're here to clean up their mess. In the clinic, Dr. Mia Chen was connecting final pieces of evidence when her computer flagged something in the weapons data. "These designs," she told Marcus over their secure channel, "they're modified versions of classified military projects. Someone's been selling secrets." Rivera's remaining operators took up defensive positions around the cartel compound, but their focus had shifted. They weren't fighting for territory anymore. They were protecting evidence, trying to prevent their master's exposure. "Burn everything," Rivera ordered, his voice tight with controlled panic. "They can't find proof of the connection." But Marcus had anticipated this too. While Rivera's men focused on the compound, civilian observers documented every vehicle, every face, every connection. The defense contractor's very presence confirmed what Marcus had spent months proving. "Your own people sold you out." Marcus's voice came through Rivera's command net. "They're not here to help you. They're here to bury you." Rosa Carson, watching from her observation post, saw the cartel organization tear itself apart. Sanchez and Lopez found themselves facing rebellion as their own members realized how they'd been used. "We were supposed to be outlaws," one veteran cartel soldier told Sanchez, throwing down his patches, "not puppets for corporate wars." At his ranch, Marcus met with Jackson and his other veterans, their expressions grim. "Just like Yemen," Jackson said quietly. "The same players, different board. This time we've got proof," Marcus replied. "Proof of who's really behind the weapons program, who's financing it, who's profiting from it. Proof they can't bury." The defense contractors moved with cold efficiency. their teams spreading through town like a virus. But everywhere they turned, they found Marcus's preparations waiting. Every attempt to contain the situation exposed them further. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," their leader, a man named Phillips, told Marcus during a tense confrontation at the cafe. "These weapons programs are vital for national security." "No," Marcus's voice carried absolute certainty. "They're vital for profit. The designs you've stolen, the prototypes you're selling, they're meant for subjugation, not defense." Dr. Chen's evidence reached multiple agencies simultaneously, carefully routed through channels Marcus had prepared months in advance. The weapons program, the corporate connections, the corrupted officials, all of it documented beyond denial. Rivera watched his world collapse from his command post. His superiors had gone dark, his corporate masters had arrived to eliminate liability, and his own men were beginning to understand they'd been sacrificed. "You knew," he transmitted to Marcus, "you knew they'd burn us as soon as exposure threatened them. This whole thing, you wanted them to send their cleaners," Rivera realized. "Had to prove who was really giving the orders," Marcus replied. "Ugamli. Had to make them show themselves." The defense contractor's presence changed the nature of the conflict. These weren't cartel soldiers or hired guns. These were men who'd orchestrated regime changes, who toppled governments through perfectly legal paperwork. "They'll try to bury this legally first," Marcus told Sheriff Castillo. "When that fails, they'll resort to what they know best, making problems disappear." Shadow Valley hummed with tension as corporate security teams faced off against Marcus's civilian defense network. But this wasn't the same town they tried to intimidate months ago. These people had learned from Marcus, had absorbed lessons written in blood across 30 years of shadow wars. "Your corporate masters made a critical mistake," Marcus transmitted on all frequencies. "They forgot the most important lesson from Project Phantom. A community united is stronger than any weapon you can design." The sun set on a town transformed. Federal agents documented evidence while corporate lawyers tried to contain the exposure. But Marcus's network had already ensured the truth couldn't be buried. Hundreds of civilian witnesses, multiple agencies involved, evidence spread too widely. "To suppress. You've started a war," Phillips warned Marcus during their final confrontation. "My employers won't forgive this exposure." "No," Marcus replied softly. "I finished one. Your employers forgot something vital. Sometimes the strongest weapons aren't the ones you can hold in your hands. Sometimes they're the ones you find in ordinary people who've decided they won't be afraid anymore." As night fell over Shadow Valley, the defense contractors retreated to their hotels, their phones burning with calls from panicked executives. They'd come to bury evidence and instead found themselves exposed, their very presence confirming the corruption Marcus had spent months documenting. Rivera, watching his world burn, finally understood the true scope of Marcus's strategy. The ranch, the town, the weapons shipment, all of it had been orchestrated to expose something bigger, something that had thought itself untouchable. And in the growing darkness, Marcus Ramirez allowed himself a grim smile. The real war wasn't fought with weapons or violence. It was fought with truth, truth that could topple empires built on lies, truth that could expose corruption, no matter how deeply it had rooted itself in power. The battle for Shadow Valley had become something else entirely, a referendum on who really controlled the shadows of power, and what happened when ordinary people decided to shine light into those dark corners. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I can continue with the next part if you'd like. Would you prefer I keep going with the story from this point?